The hollow echoes of war reverberated across the galaxy. Earth, once the thriving cradle of humanity, now lay in tatters, a mere shell of its former glory. The Zereth, an ancient alien race of ruthless conquerors, had struck swiftly and decisively, ravaging human colonies with their superior technology and overwhelming numbers. The few remaining pockets of human resistance were scattered across the stars, barely holding on to hope. The once mighty fleets were broken, and the capital of humanity, Earth itself, was nothing but a burning wreckage, its orbiting stations now silent tombs. In the midst of this despair, the legend of Captain Eric Valen resurfaced. No longer was he the celebrated war hero who had once led humanity's forces to great victories. Eric Valen had been exiled, branded a traitor after a failed mission, an outcome that cost the lives of his entire fleet. His name was wiped from history, his achievements erased, and his exile kept in the shadows of government secrecy. But whispers persisted, stories told in hushed voices by those who believed in the myth of the forgotten hero. And now, those whispers were turning into a signal, a faint, desperate call carried across the stars. Commander Lyra Quinn stood at the edge of a dilapidated Resistance command center, staring at the flickering holographic projection in front of her. It was a message, buried in a series of encrypted files that had been sent from a long-forgotten sector. The message contained only a name, Eric Valen, and coordinates to an uncharted space station at the edge of the galaxy. Lyra's heart raced as she processed the implications. The Resistance was losing ground fast. Earth was on the brink of complete annihilation. The Zereth had begun to implement their final phase, an assault on the remaining human strongholds, designed to wipe out every last remnant of human life. The Federation was crippled, and the last hope for survival seemed to fade with each passing day. But now this message, this name, Eric Valen. Lyra had heard the stories of his heroism, of the battles he had won, and the reputation he had once earned. But she also knew of the darker side of that story, of the betrayal, the exile, the destruction of his fleet. Humanity had written him off. Yet if this message was real, if Eric Valen had returned, then perhaps, just perhaps, he was the key to humanity's salvation. She turned to her second-in-command, Lieutenant Jacerin, who had been by her side since the beginning of the war. His face was etched with weariness, the toll of years of endless conflict evident in his eyes. "Lyra," Jace said, his voice low but steady, "are you really considering this? He's just a ghost, a shadow of the past. What if this is a trap? What if—" "I don't have the luxury of doubts anymore," Lyra interrupted, her voice resolute. "If this is a trap, then we walk into it, guns blazing. But if it's real, if Eric Valen is out there, then he's the only one who can turn this around. We have nothing left to lose." Jace hesitated for a moment, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Then, with a deep sigh, he nodded. "All right, I'll prep the team." Lyra turned back to the hologram, her fingers brushing across the coordinates, locking them into the navigation system. The stars beyond the shattered remnants of Earth now seemed less like distant, unreachable points of light, and more like a road that could lead to salvation. "Set a course," she ordered, her voice cold with determination. "We're going to find Eric Valen." And with that, the last hope for humanity's future set course for a forgotten corner of the galaxy, where the hero of old might just emerge from the shadows to answer the call. The journey was long, and the path uncertain. Lyra's crew moved in silence, their faces grim with the weight of their mission. The coordinates had taken them to a desolate, forgotten sector of the galaxy, far from any established human territories. The stars here were dimmer, and the blackness of space seemed heavier, as though it carried the weight of centuries of abandonment. No one had ventured to this part of the galaxy in years. The Resistance's best minds had sifted through the encrypted transmission with care, but there was no guarantee that Eric Valen, or any hope, would be waiting for them. As the crew navigated through the quiet void, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The signal had been so faint, its message so brief, and yet there had been something in it. An echo of a lost cause, a whisper from a hero long forgotten. Could it really be him? Could Eric Valen, the man who had once stood as humanity's shining light, still be alive? Or had the years of exile twisted him beyond recognition? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden crackle of static on the comms. A distorted voice broke through, the words indecipherable at first, but then it cleared, just enough. Lyra Quinn, Commander, you came. The voice was rough, gravelly, but unmistakable. It was a voice she had only heard in the records of the past, a voice that had once rallied thousands of soldiers to battle. It was Eric Valen, the lost legend, speaking directly to her. "Eric?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. Her voice was steady, but inside, the weight of that moment felt unbearable. "Where are you?" A low chuckle echoed through the comms, tinged with a bitterness that made Lyra's stomach tighten. "Where I've always been," Eric replied, "waiting, alone." A small flicker of light appeared on their scanners, drawing closer. It was a ship, rusted and battered, drifting through the void like a ghost. It was a relic, a warship from the early days of the human fleet, one that had long been decommissioned and forgotten. The hull was scarred from years of neglect, and the engines emitted a low hum, but the ship was functional enough to travel. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, modern ships the Resistance used. It was a relic of an older age, just like Eric. The ship docked in the crumbling space station, a place that seemed untouched by time, yet broken by it. The exterior of the station was dark, its once pristine surface marred by neglect and decay. As the docking bay door slowly slid open, Lyra and her team stepped into the shadowed interior, the dim lights flickering overhead. There, standing in the center of the hangar, was Eric Valen. The man who had once been humanity's hope stood before them, but he was not the hero they had imagined. His once pristine military uniform was torn and stained, his face drawn and weary. A thick beard and unkempt hair obscured his features, and his eyes, once full of fire and conviction, were now dull, haunted by the passage of time and the weight of failure. He stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. It was clear that he had not expected anyone to come for him, much less a group of strangers bearing the weight of humanity's last hope. "I wondered if anyone would come," Eric said, his voice low, "but you're not the ones I expected." Lyra took a cautious step forward. "I'm Commander Lyra Quinn. We came for you. The Zereth, they've nearly destroyed us. We need you, Eric. We need the man who once led humanity's fight for survival." Eric's eyes flicked to the ground. His hands, calloused and scared, hung loosely at his sides. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, without warning, he turned and began to walk away, his steps slow and deliberate. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said, his voice quiet but edged with something darker. "I failed once. I led my fleet to their deaths. I let them down, and I let humanity down. You're better off without me." Lyra's heart sank, but she didn't stop. She followed him undeterred. "No, Eric," she said firmly. "We're not better off. We need you, your experience, your leadership. The war isn't over. The Zereth are planning something catastrophic. Earth, our people, are on the brink of extinction. You were the one who could defeat them. You are still the one who can." Eric stopped in his tracks, his back to her. The silence hung heavy between them. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, his voice a ghost of its former self. "But the man you're looking for, he's gone, and I'm not sure he can ever come back." But before Lyra could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside the station, followed by the unmistakable sound of Zereth warships. They had found them. Eric's eyes narrowed as he turned to face the crew. The past was behind him, but the present demanded action. He looked at Lyra, his gaze hardening. "Looks like the galaxy still needs a hero after all," he muttered, reaching for a blaster holstered at his side. Lara nodded, a fire igniting in her chest. This wasn't over. The Xerath wouldn't win, not if Eric Valen was still breathing. The rumble of incoming fire echoed through the crumbling station's corridors, vibrating the walls as the first wave of Xerath ships made their descent. The once abandoned station, now the last hope of humanity's desperate resistance, was about to become a battleground. Lara's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no time for fear. The Xerath were here, and they weren't coming for a chat. Eric Valen was already moving, his body betraying the years of solitude with swift, practiced motions. The ghost of the man who had once led humanity's might in battle was coming alive again, the old fire in his eyes rekindling in the face of danger. His hands moved over weapons, discarded long ago but now essential for the fight ahead. Get to the control room. Eric barked, his voice no longer quiet or reluctant. It was the voice of a leader, a man who had once commanded fleets. His voice carried with it the authority of someone who had seen war and survived. Lock the doors, fortify the defenses. We hold this station or we die trying. Lara didn't hesitate. She signaled to her team, and they sprinted toward the command center, the air thick with the tension of impending conflict. Behind them, Eric moved with the same speed, even more driven now, his years of exile falling away with every step. In the control room, Lyra took the lead. The walls were lined with outdated consoles and control panels, relics of a time before the war had turned everything to ash. Yet, somehow, these systems still worked. She punched in commands to activate the station's automated defenses, her fingers dancing across the worn keys. The lights flickered, and a low hum resonated as the old turrets began to power up. The station's defenses weren't much, but they would have to be enough. "What's the status on our shields?" Lyra asked, her voice tense but steady. "Shields are weak," Jace reported from the operations desk, his face etched with worry. "The Xerath will breach in minutes." "We don't have minutes," Eric's voice interrupted as he entered the control room, his expression hard. He looked like a man who had walked out of the past and was now fully awake, prepared to face them head-on. "We need to strike first. I'll take the external turrets. Lyra, you lead the ground defense." Lyra's pulse quickened. "You can't hold them off alone. You'll be overwhelmed." Eric's eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of the man he used to be, the one who had inspired thousands. "I'll hold them as long as I can. Just make sure this station holds long enough to make a real counterattack." Without waiting for further objection, Eric turned and strode out of the room, his figure vanishing into the darkness of the station's hallways. Lara's team didn't waste a second. She grabbed a plasma rifle, checking its energy levels, and passed out additional weapons to the rest of the squad. The Xerath weren't going to just let them sit tight. There was no way they could escape, no way to run from the coming storm. The only option was to fight back. "Everyone to your positions," Lyra ordered. Her voice was like steel now, hardened by necessity. She could hear the distant roar of the Xerath ships breaking through the atmosphere, and the pounding of their boots was growing louder. She could already sense the impending chaos, but it was no longer something to fear. It was something they could fight. As the ground shook with the tremors of impact, the sound of blaster fire echoed through the halls. The Xerath were on them. Lara and her team took their positions, crouching behind crates and equipment, weapons raised. Every corner, every shadow was a potential danger. The Xerath soldiers were ruthless, efficient, trained to wipe out their enemies with surgical precision. They were the apex of a violent, war-hardened species. But humanity had something the Xerath didn't, a spirit of survival that burned brighter than any enemy. Outside, the fight was more chaotic. Eric had reached the external turrets. The old weapons came to life with a hiss of pressurized air and the crackle of energy fields as they began to fire, unloading plasma rounds into the approaching Xerath ships. His face was a mask of focus, his actions fast and calculated. He was a man out of time, But in the chaos of battle, he was exactly where he needed to be. As explosions lit up the dark expanse of space around the station, Eric's voice crackled over the comms. "Keep your heads down, Quinn. I'm giving you a window, but it won't last long." Lyra nodded, her hand tightening around her rifle. This was their moment. They had no choice but to fight, to hold the line until Eric and the rest of them had a chance to take the fight to the Zareth. The battle for the Forgotten Station had begun. The air inside the station grew thick with tension as the Zareth forces stormed the station's lower levels. Lyra crouched behind an overturned table, her pulse quickening with each loud thud that echoed through the hallways. The sound of boots on metal was deafening, and the wall seemed to tremble under the weight of the assault. She exchanged a glance with Jace, who was crouched beside her, his eyes steely with determination. "They're coming," Jace muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. The steady hum of the turrets outside told them that Eric was holding off the air assault, but it wouldn't last forever. The Zareth were relentless, and their ground forces were closing in fast. Lyra's hand hovered over the comms, but she didn't make contact yet. The Zareth were sophisticated, and any signal could be intercepted, giving them a tactical advantage. For now, silence was their best ally. The first wave of Zareth soldiers rounded the corner, their towering insectoid forms emerging from the shadows. Their armor gleamed in the low light, and their eyes, black and soulless, scanned the area for signs of resistance. Lyra's team held their breath, waiting for the right moment to strike. "On my mark," Lyra whispered. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was the first step toward taking back humanity's future. As the first Zareth soldier took a step into the open, Lyra's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Now, in an instant, the room exploded into action. Blaster fire lit up the shadows, crackling as it collided with the Zareth soldiers' energy shields. The impact sent a jolt of satisfaction through Lyra's chest as one soldier fell, their shield flickering out of existence. But there were more, many more. The Zareth advanced in a tight formation, firing back with lethal precision. Jace and Lyra ducked behind their cover, the barrage of enemy fire creating a storm of blinding light and searing heat. Lyra's heart raced as she peeked over the edge of the table, lining up her shot. She squeezed the trigger, her aim true. A Zareth soldier crumpled to the floor, the creature's body twitching with the final remnants of life. Another took its place. The resistance fought like cornered animals, each moment of survival drawing them closer to victory, but they were vastly outnumbered. Lyra glanced over to see her squad moving with practiced efficiency, each member working in harmony, as though the years of conflict had bound them together in a single, unstoppable force. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. The battle raged on, and with each passing minute, the walls of the station felt smaller. Every corner held a new wave of enemies, each more determined to crush them than the last. The turrets outside fired relentlessly, lighting up the darkness of space, but it was clear the Zareth were adapting, pressing forward in tactical formations, trying to push through the defenses. "Commander," a voice shouted over the comms. It was Eric's, his voice gruff and tight with the intensity of the battle. "The turrets can only hold for so long. You need to get to the main reactor. It's the only way we can power the backup shield systems. If we don't, we're done for." Lyra's mind raced as she processed his words. The main reactor was deep within the station's core, heavily guarded, but it was their only hope. Without those shields, the Zareth would flood the station with overwhelming force. The plan was clear. She had to get to the reactor, no matter what it took. "We're on it," Lyra replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Jace, we're moving. Keep them covered." Without another word, she gestured for the team to move. They pushed forward through the hallways, their boots pounding on the steel floors, adrenaline coursing through their veins. As they neared the reactor, the fighting grew fiercer. The Zereth forces were pushing in from every side now, and the air was thick with the stench of smoke and the buzz of plasma fire. They reached the entrance to the reactor chamber, but it was locked. Lyra cursed under her breath, but before she could act, Jace stepped forward, his hands already at work on the security panel. With a few quick movements, the door slid open, revealing the heart of the station, its core humming with barely contained power. But standing in the center of the room, a new threat awaited them. A Zereth officer, larger and more imposing than the others, stood at the controls, his eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. He turned to face them, his mandibles clicking as he prepared for the final strike. "Get ready," Lyra muttered under her breath, knowing that this would be their toughest fight yet. The Zereth officer stood motionless, its glowing eyes locking onto Lyra's squad. Its elongated, insectoid limbs twitched with anticipation, and its jagged armor reflected the dim light of the reactor core. The air was thick with the hum of raw power, the reactor's energy swirling around them in a deadly dance. Lyra could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The Zereth had nearly reached their goal. If they didn't act fast, humanity's last hope would be extinguished in an instant. "Take him down," Lyra shouted, her voice sharp as a whip. In an instant, the team sprang into action. Jace and Aerie moved to flank the officer, weapons raised, while Lyra dove behind a large energy conduit. The Zereth officer hissed, its mandibles clicking in a language Lyra couldn't understand, but its intentions were clear. It raised its arm, and a pulsating energy blade hummed to life, crackling with deadly force. Lyra fired first, the plasma rifle roaring in her hands as she unleashed a barrage of shots aimed at the officer's chest. The Zereth moved with terrifying speed, dodging the shots with a grace that seemed unnatural for such a massive creature. It retaliated almost instantly, sending a shockwave of energy from its weapon toward Lyra's position. The blast hit the wall beside her, sending shards of metal flying. She dove to the side just in time, narrowly avoiding the blast that tore apart her cover. "Watch out," Jace shouted as he took a shot at the officer, hitting it squarely in the shoulder. But the creature barely flinched. It was almost as if the Zereth officer's body was impervious to the blasts that had brought down so many of its comrades. The Zereth officer charged, its blade slicing through the air with a terrifying hum. Aerie moved to intercept, but the officer was too fast. It swung the blade downward, and Aerie barely managed to raise his rifle in time to deflect the strike, the blade scraping against the barrel with a screech of metal. Aerie was sent sprawling backward, his weapon slipping from his grip. "Get up," Lyra yelled, barely avoiding another deadly swing from the officer. Her heart raced as she surveyed the situation, the odds stacking higher against them with every second. The Zereth officer, undeterred, advanced on Aerie, but before it could land a fatal blow, Lyra dove forward, her rifle raised. She fired again, this time hitting the officer in the side. The plasma burst tore through its armor, and the officer staggered, a flicker of pain crossing its otherwise stoic face. But the Zereth were relentless. The officer turned with an unnatural speed, bringing its energy blade down toward Lyra in a swift arc. She twisted just in time, feeling the searing heat of the blade narrowly miss her. It took everything in her to keep moving, to stay ahead of the officer's onslaught. "Now, take the shot," Lyra shouted to Jace, her voice cutting through the chaos. Jace, breathless and with sweat pouring down his face, steadied his aim. He squeezed the trigger, sending a high-powered shot straight into the officer's midsection. This time, the officer staggered back, its energy blade flickering out as its power reserves drained. Lyra saw her chance. She rushed forward, bringing her own weapon to bear. With a roar, she unleashed a final burst of plasma, striking the officer in the chest. The shot hit its mark, sending the Zereth officer collapsing to the ground with a guttural hiss. It twitched once, then fell silent, its glowing eyes dimming. For a moment, the station was still. The hum of the reactor seemed to echo in the silence, and Lyra could hear the sound of her own ragged breathing as adrenaline surged through her veins. "We did it," Aerie panted, pushing himself to his feet. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her mind was already moving, calculating their next steps. The reactor was still active, its power pulsing through the station, but time was running out. The Xerath had probably sent reinforcements by now. She could feel the weight of their enemy's next wave pressing against them. "We've won this battle, but the war isn't over," Lyra said grimly, looking down at the fallen officer. The creature's blood leaked from its wounds, a viscous, dark liquid pooling on the cold floor. "She couldn't afford to linger. We need to move. Now." As if on cue, the station's lights flickered once more. A loud clanging noise rang out from the entrance, followed by the unmistakable sound of booted feet. The next wave was already here. Lyra turned to her team, her eyes steely with resolve. "Get to the backup generators. We're holding this station until the cavalry arrives, no matter what it takes." Without waiting for a response, she bolted for the door, her squad close behind. The station was their last line of defense. The Xerath would not take it without a fight. As they moved deeper into the heart of the station, the ground shook again. This time, it wasn't just the sounds of the Xerath's assault. It was something more. The final countdown was beginning. The corridors of the station had become a labyrinth of smoke and chaos. The deeper Lyra's team moved, the more desperate the situation grew. With every step, they could feel the Xerath closing in. The sound of their boots reverberated through the metal halls, a constant reminder of the enemy's relentless pursuit. Eric's warning echoed in Lyra's mind: hold the station until the cavalry arrives. But she had no illusions about how long that might take. The Xerath were methodical and swift, and the station's defenses were already strained. They reached the backup generators. Lyra quickly assessed the control panels, her hands flying across the console as she tried to power up the secondary shielding systems. The flickering lights above her head painted the room in an eerie glow, casting shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The hum of the reactor was deafening, its power feeding through the station like blood through veins. "Come on," she muttered under her breath, pressing a button to initiate the sequence. A deep whirring sound came from the far side of the room, followed by a burst of static through the comms. The countdown had begun. A blue light flickered to life on the control panel. Lyra exhaled in relief, but it was short-lived. The secondary shields were coming online, but the energy levels were dangerously low. They'd only have enough power to hold for a few minutes, not nearly long enough to repel the Xerath's next wave. "We don't have much time," Jace said, his voice grim. He was scanning the terminal for any signs of enemy movement. "They'll breach any moment now." Lyra nodded, already preparing for what was next. There was no way they could fight off the Xerath if they flooded the station, not with the limited defenses they had left. They needed to buy time. Time for what? Lyra couldn't afford to think about that. Her job now was to keep her team alive. "Everyone, to the upper levels," she ordered, her tone steady but urgent. "We'll use the last of the turrets to slow them down. If we can't hold them at the core, we need to stop them from reaching the reactor. We need more time for the backup systems to kick in." Her team moved quickly, their motions fluid and practiced as they made their way to the elevator. Lyra's mind raced with calculations, options narrowing, the weight of responsibility bearing down on her. They couldn't afford mistakes. The Xerath were relentless, and their time was running out. As they ascended, the station's tremors grew stronger. The metal walls creaked ominously, as if the very bones of the place were groaning under the pressure of the impending onslaught. Lyra clenched her fists, readying herself for whatever was to come. She had seen how the Xerath fought, swift, brutal, and without mercy. But she had also seen how humanity fought, desperate, resourceful, and unwilling to surrender. The elevator doors slid open, and Lyra motioned for her team to take positions. The upper levels of the station were already being fortified, gutted control rooms and makeshift barricades made from anything they could scavenge. As they huddled behind their cover, the unmistakable roar of Zereth forces echoed through the station's halls, a sound that made Lyra's blood run cold. "They're here," Aerie whispered, his eyes scanning the hallway through a slit in the barricade. Lyra's heart thudded in her chest. She had expected this, but now, in the thick of it, the reality of it was much more visceral. The Zereth were here, and they were about to launch an all-out assault on the station. She looked to her team one last time. "We hold the line. We fight until the last of us falls. If we don't, we'll never get another chance." Jace, Aerie, and the rest of the squad nodded, their faces hard with resolve. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about surviving long enough for the backup shields to come online, and if they didn't make it, ensuring that humanity had a fighting chance for the future. As the first wave of Zereth soldiers rounded the corner, their skeletal forms moving like shadows through the smoke-filled hallway, Lyra's mind cleared. There was no room for fear anymore, only the cold, hard need to fight. "Open fire," she commanded. Blaster fire erupted, cutting through the silence. Lyra's rifle bucked in her hands as she took aim, sending a volley of plasma bolts into the advancing Zereth forces. The team followed suit, their coordinated attacks causing the first line of enemies to fall back. But this was only the beginning. More Zereth were coming. The countdown continued. The shields were almost online. Lyra gritted her teeth and prepared for the worst. The air was thick with smoke and the crackle of plasma fire as Lyra's team held their ground. The Zereth were relentless, their chitinous forms advancing steadily through the chaos. Undeterred by the losses they'd suffered, every moment felt like an eternity. The station's metal walls reverberated with the sounds of combat, the rhythmic thud of heavy boots, the deafening roar of blasters, and the hissing of Zereth weapons cutting through the air. Lyra crouched behind a barricade, her rifle aimed steady as she picked off the approaching soldiers. Each shot felt like a prayer, a desperate attempt to stem the tide of Zereth forces. They were pushing forward, slowly but surely, and with every second that passed, the countdown in the back of her mind loomed larger. The backup shields were close to activation, but not yet online. They needed more time, their time, not the Zereths. "Fall back to the second perimeter," Lyra ordered, her voice carrying over the static of the comms. Her squad responded instantly, retreating in a tight formation toward the secondary defenses. They had no choice. The first wave of Zereth had been repelled, but the second wave, more powerful, more organized, was on its way. Aerie fired a final shot, taking down a Zereth soldier charging at him, then followed Lyra's orders without hesitation. Jace, moving with practiced precision, covered their retreat, turning to fire at any Zereth soldier that dared to follow. The barricades they'd set up in the main corridor would buy them a little more time, but the Zereth were clever. They would adapt quickly. They needed to make it to the secondary shield generators, where they could buy even more time. Lyra's heart raced as they moved down the hall, their boots pounding the steel floors. The backup shields would give them a chance to regroup. But that was all it would be, a chance. The true battle, she knew, was yet to come. They reached the secondary defense line just as the first wave of Zereth soldiers began to surge into the hall. Lyra's squad quickly took up positions behind the fortified barriers, ready to fight to the last breath. The turrets, still operational, hummed to life, firing in short bursts at the incoming enemies. The Zereth screamed in rage as they advanced, their heavy armor absorbing most of the fire. "We're going to need more than this," Aerie said, gritting his teeth as another volley of plasma fire tore into the Zereth ranks. "We can't hold them off much longer." Lyra nodded, her mind racing. She knew that the Zereth would only escalate their assault. They would keep coming, wave after wave, until they either succeeded or were wiped out. But she wasn't going to let them take the station without a fight. "We've got one last shot," Lyra said, her voice resolute. "If we can keep the pressure on them long enough, the shields will activate. The Zereth won't know what hit them." Her team nodded, rallying together despite the overwhelming odds. There was no time to second-guess their plan. There was no time to consider failure. This was their final stand. The Zereth began to pour into the room in full force. They advanced with terrifying speed, their weapons firing relentlessly. Lyra gripped her rifle tighter, her hands steady despite the rising tension. Every shot she fired felt like it might be her last, but she couldn't afford to think about that. Her squad was counting on her. Humanity was counting on them. "Now," Lyra shouted, signaling her team to press forward. In a coordinated assault, the squad surged from behind their cover, firing on the advancing Zereth soldiers. Blaster fire lit up the darkened hall, each shot a desperate attempt to slow the enemy's advance. Lyra moved fluidly, her years of training guiding her through the chaos. She dropped a soldier with a precise shot to the head, then ducked as enemy fire whizzed past her. The shields were close. She could feel it in her bones, the electric charge of energy building in the air. The seconds stretched into hours, but they couldn't let up, not even for a moment. They had to keep fighting, no matter what. The Zereth were nearly upon them. Their insectoid forms were a blur of motion, closing in from every direction. Lyra took a deep breath, preparing for the final wave. She knew that after this, everything would either change for humanity or end in defeat. "Hold the line," she roared, knowing this would be the hardest moment of their fight. And just as it seemed like the Zereth would overwhelm them, a surge of energy erupted from the reactor core. The backup shields activated in a burst of brilliant blue light, encasing the station in a protective barrier. The Zereth faltered, momentarily stunned by the sudden shift in power. Lyra's squad seized the moment, launching a fierce counteroffensive. The tide was turning, but only just. "Keep pushing," Lyra shouted, her voice full of fiery determination. "This is our station. We are humanity's last defense." And with that rallying cry, they fought on, their spirits reignited by the flickering light of hope. The sudden surge of energy from the reactor sent a shockwave through the station, and for a moment, everything stood still. The backup shields hummed to life, bathing the station in a protective blue glow. The Zereth soldiers, taken by surprise, stumbled backward, their momentum broken by the unexpected force field that now surrounded them. It was a brief moment of respite, an opportunity that Lyra's squad wasn't going to waste. "Now," Lyra shouted, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. With the shields in place, the Zereth forces were momentarily unable to advance. Lyra's team surged forward, relentless in their assault. Jace, Aerie, and the others fired with deadly precision, hitting Zereth soldiers in their weak spots, under their armor, at the joints, and along their exposed limbs. The force field protected them from the worst of the Zereth's counterattacks, allowing them to take out several soldiers without fear of overwhelming return fire. Lyra's mind raced as she assessed the situation. The shields were holding, but only for a limited time. She could already feel the power from the reactor core beginning to fluctuate. The Zereth would find a way through, or they would escalate their attack in another form. But for now, humanity had gained a precious moment of time. Aerie, scanning the battlefield, nodded to Lyra. "The reinforcements are close. If we can hold them off for a few more minutes, we'll have backup." "Not just backup," Lyra said, a hard edge to her voice. "We'll have victory." With renewed strength, the squad pressed forward, laying down suppressive fire. The Zereth forces, though disoriented, were beginning to regroup. The steady hum of the backup shields and the rising intensity of their weapons told Lyra that the final push was coming. She could feel the station tremble as the Zereth gathered their strength for one last assault. "We need to take down their command unit," Jace said, his eyes narrowed in determination. "If we can eliminate their leader, the rest will fall apart. They'll be disorganized without their strategy." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the battlefield for the leader of the Zereth forces. It wasn't hard to spot. The officer was larger than the others, its silhouette cutting through the smoke-filled air. It had taken cover behind a group of soldiers, coordinating their movements with chilling precision. Lyra's heart pounded. This was the final test. "We move in," she commanded. "Jace Airy with me. The rest, hold the line." They moved swiftly, using the cover of the shields and the smoke to their advantage. As they approached the Zereth officer, the air seemed to grow heavier, charged with the tension of the final battle. Lyra's eyes locked on the officer's glowing, malevolent gaze, knowing that only one of them would survive this encounter. The officer stepped forward, raising its weapon, a massive energy staff that crackled with raw power. It pointed it toward Lyra and her team, and the space between them filled with a deadly barrage of energy blasts. Lyra dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast that followed. Jace and Airy fired in unison, their shots forcing the Zereth officer to stagger back. The officer hissed, its mandibles clicking in a frantic rhythm, and it lashed out with the energy staff, sending a shockwave of destructive force across the room. But Lyra was faster. With a roar, she charged forward, using her momentum to close the distance. She rolled just under the officer's weapon strike, firing her plasma rifle directly at its chest. The shot hit its mark. The officer's armor crumpled, its body twitching violently as the plasma coursed through its systems. With a final, guttural scream, the officer collapsed, its weapon falling to the floor with a resounding thud. For a moment, everything went quiet. The battlefield fell still, the last of the Zereth soldiers frozen in confusion as their command structure crumbled. Then, as if on cue, the remaining Zereth forces began to retreat, disarray rippling through their ranks. "We've done it," Airy breathed, lowering his weapon. "We actually did it." Lyra allowed herself a brief moment of relief, her eyes scanning the retreating enemy forces. The tide had turned. The Zereth were broken, their morale shattered without their commander to lead them. The station, once on the brink of destruction, had become a symbol of humanity's unyielding resolve. As the backup shields continued to shimmer, Lyra turned to face her squad. They were battered, exhausted, but they had won. Humanity's last stand had become a victory. "All teams, report in," she said, her voice calm but full of pride. "We hold the line. The Zereth will not take Earth, not today." Through the cracked comms, the voices of her squad mates came through, each one alive, each one fighting still. But it wasn't just her squad anymore. The cavalry had arrived. The reinforcements had come. The station's defenses, bolstered by the backup shields, held strong. Earth had won its first battle against the Zereth, but Lyra knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy was vast, and the war had only just started. Humanity had proven something that day. They were not a species to be underestimated. The final beacon, once thought to be humanity's last cry, now stood as the signal of their resurgence. The Zereth had underestimated them. They had failed. Humanity would rise. And the stars would tremble.